So we were talking about the fact that you've been a dance critic and a theater critic, and I wonder if that might be a way to get into this topic of interpretation of dance. That is, what is the difference? What are the different interpretive challenges posed by theater versus dance?
Well, if I talked about what's specific to theatre, I'd be here forever, because I does talk about what's so, specific to Shakespeare and Stoppard, and there is no dance equivalent. But if I try and think of what is peculiar to dance, actually, no. Before I do, and I do want to say, having been a theatre critic, at some point I began to realise that I did think always of dance as a form of theatre. At least dance in theatre was theatrical, and a lot of it was drama, and that the greatest choreographers we care about were all inventors of particular kinds of theatre. In England, you always got a theatre following for Pina Bausch, you always got, as you do here, a theatre following for Matthew Vaughan, but I always used to think, actually, of course, Balanchine is one of the great theatre masters, as is, I think, Merce Cunningham. Peter Brook recognised Cunningham, and that's true of Ashton and all the others. To start thinking that way really did start to open up a new avenue for me in writing. But I was going off the track. What's specific to dance?
Maybe I raised the question because I think, I don't know who's going to be watching this, whether it's more theater people or dance people or just an average viewer, but I think maybe the average viewer thinks of theater as maybe less esoteric because it deals in this medium of words, and that maybe to write about theater, you're already working in the medium of words, so it's maybe less of a challenge.
It's so much easier being a theatre critic. I so well remember certain plays, and fellow theatre critics used to say, "This one's going to be tough to write about, isn't it?" And I would say, "You have no idea. Swan Lake is harder to write about than just about any play."
And why is that?
Because of words. If I talk about a problem in To Be or Not to Be, I can at least use those words. You have that very ambiguous scene between Justice Shallow and Justice Silence in Henry IV, Part 2, which in some moods I call the greatest scene in world drama. But at least I can quote the words, and that's done half my work for me. When I'm trying to explain what I think is one of the most key images in Swan Lake, and a fairly obvious image, and one of the more describable images, nonetheless I take up paragraphs. But so I'll try and give you that image, or two images from Swan Lake. Let me think. First time I saw Swan Lake, the moment that got most into my nervous system is the famous exit for Odette at the end of Act 2. I was watching Nureyev and Monica Mason, and he's in that corner over there, and he kneels, and she does this famous leave-taking, and you feel the gravitational pull of Rothbart's corner over there, and she's on point, brewing like mad, trying to hold on to him, but the whole of gravity is pulling her back. And I remember then gradually the arms extending, and the way Monica Mason did it then, and never quite again, was just to send ripples down the arms sideways like that, and then the whole face went completely glacial as she became a swan. And I went with my old friend Claire, who was still a close friend of mine. We both admitted the next day we had tried to do the ripples in our arms that we'd seen her do. Now I can demonstrate it for you, but to just try and describe those ripples and why it seemed inhuman, the kind of quality of the ripples that she was showing was extraordinary. And then if I could go on about how Mel Park, who became my Odette of choice, did it quite differently once she got to the changing moment in the music, when suddenly you hear the Fate theme very powerfully. Suddenly her arms would her face would freeze and look up, and then the whole arms would go into the Swan Lake port de bras as she went buoyed off sideways. And I remember total shivers down my spine at that frozen metamorphosis quality. Of course, the one everybody used to talk about in those days was Makarova, who used to do, which she got to that centre point and the Fate theme happened, and she would turn round and send these undulations down her back, and so you'd see the shoulders. To me, that was always just an effect. It wasn't sincere, it wasn't about it. But it made Swan Lake so interesting. So you are arguing passionately about the different ways these things could be done. So that's one image of movement. The image that mattered hugely to anybody watching the old Royal Ballet way of doing Swan Lake, and I believe it is the old Russian way, but nobody in Russia now dances this way, is at the most intimate moment of the pas de deux. She keeps breaking away from him, and finally she breaks away once too often, and he doesn't follow her. And she goes back to Rothbart's corner, and then because perhaps he hasn't followed her, she turns around and he's looking away. And this time it's she who returns of her own volition to him and just arrives in front of him, standing there, arms up there, leg back in attitude. And then he, when the music is at its most intimate with the cello and the violin coming so close together, brings that arm down and then that arm down and just rocks her in his arms. And her neck cranes back towards him. And that was always the most intimate moment in the whole of Swan Lake. And it is part of, I know it's part of the old Russian text. I became such a pedant about this because it mattered to me so much. And there were so many photographs of the best British dancers doing it, going back to Fontaine. But I remember then asking Danilova when I met her once, did you do that? And she said, oh yes, and I got it from Lukom and so forth. So it did go back to the old Russian tradition. Somewhere along the lines, the Soviets have changed it. Anyway.
Well, already we've gotten into history and to different
and to text, so it becomes so complicated. But even that, you see, I think is quite easy to describe, relatively speaking, because you're talking of a rocking in the arm, the sense of cradling and so forth. There we've got words. If I think of the moment in 19th century ballet that used to seem to me the most powerful single moment I ever saw in a certain performance, and it was for many people with different ballerinas, it's really hard to describe. It's in Sleeping Beauty. It's at the climax of the Act 3 variation. The music goes da 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 da, and that's how it begins. And then it has the variations on the music, and then the music comes back, but now slow. It's still this solo violin leading, and she does a diagonal from that corner down to that corner of the same petit développé 16 times. And it's just the same thing. It's very petit right now, I realize. Just getting a basic step, repeat, 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 repeat. But the upper body builds. And you can argue about whether she circles the arms outwards this way or inwards that way. I've seen ballerinas do it both ways. But the point is it's a crescendo. And it should begin with her leaning forwards and doing something very small, and then the head starts to turn with it, and then gradually it should grow. And by the way, nobody does it properly anymore, but everybody I saw used to do it, so it mattered so much. And when I saw it, particularly with Lynn Seymour, that was the most overwhelming moment in 19th century ballet I'd ever seen. But I think I'd maybe already seen Svetlana Beryosova demonstrate it, so I knew how different it could be with a great ballerina. With Beryosova, it was very grand, and she just opened up into this wonderful, sort of huge, commanding princess quality. With Lynn Seymour, she was the most sensual ballerina, so you just got this creaminess, and there was a growth of sensual awareness at that moment in the Love duet. And the quality of undulation of the arms that she built up was just overwhelming. Now, I can do that in my crumb way of demonstrating to you, but just try to explain to readers why 16 petit développés and a gradual crescendo of arms and wrists matters so much. I tried in a review of New York City Ballet about 3 years ago, and it took me most of the review just to try to describe why that passage mattered so much.